Snowflakes drifted lazily from the gray winter sky, dusting the streets of the high-end shopping district. The sidewalks were lined with designer boutiques, their dazzling window displays reflecting a world of wealth and exclusivity. Luxury cars purred along the road, their sleek exteriors untouched by the slush that had begun to gather at the curbs. The people walking these streets were bundled in expensive coats, their scarves woven from cashmere, their shoes unblemished by the cold. Among them, a young black boy, just 9 years old, walked with careful steps, his sneakers worn from years of use. His coat, though warm, was second-hand, slightly too big on his small frame. His fingers, tucked into thin gloves, curled slightly against the chill. He had just left the community center where he spent most of his afternoons, finding warmth, books, and friendly faces in a city that often overlooked kids like him. He didn't mind walking through this part of town. The towering stores, the gleaming buildings, it was like another world. One he didn't belong to, but one he was curious about. He imagined what it would be like to live in a place where worries were about which coat to wear, not whether the heater at home would work through the night. As he turned the corner, he noticed a commotion near a boutique entrance. A wealthy couple stood next to a luxury SUV, the father balancing shopping bags in one hand while adjusting his scarf with the other. His wife, distracted, rummaged through her purse, her attention elsewhere. But it was the child, barely 2 years old, who caught the boy's eye. The toddler had slipped from the father's grasp, their tiny boots shuffling dangerously close to the edge of the sidewalk. The curb was higher than most, and just beyond it, cars zoomed past, their tires sloshing through the icy streets. The parents hadn't noticed, but the boy had. His breath hitched as he saw the toddler's foot slide over the edge. Their small body wobbled, arms flailing for balance, but gravity was already working against them. The boy didn't think. He ran. His feet barely touched the ground as he surged forward, the cold air slicing against his skin. A heartbeat before disaster. He lunged, his arms outstretched. His hands wrapped around the child's tiny body, yanking them back just as their weight tipped forward. They tumbled onto the cold pavement, the boy shielding the child as they hit the ground. His chest heaved, his arms locked around the toddler, protecting them from harm. The world around him seemed to slow. The chatter of shoppers, the hum of traffic, it all faded as he looked down at the child, their round cheeks flushed from the cold, their eyes wide with shock. A gasp shattered the silence. The father turned, eyes darting to his child, then to the boy holding them. His face twisted, a mix of confusion and disbelief. The mother clutched her chest, her shopping bag slipping from her hands. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then the toddler let out a giggle, oblivious to the danger they had just been in. The boy slowly sat up, still holding the child securely. He glanced at the parents, unsure of what to say. He wasn't looking for praise. He had done what anyone should do. But from the way the father was staring at him, he wasn't sure what was coming next. The boy had always known struggle. He had grown up in a neighborhood where streetlights flickered, where sirens echoed in the night, and where the world didn't always seem fair. But despite it all, he had something that many people in wealthier parts of town lacked: heart. At just 9 years old, he had already learned that kindness mattered. He helped his mother whenever he could, looking after his younger siblings when she had to work late shifts. Their apartment was small. Their meals were sometimes stretched thin, but his mother always reminded him that they had something money couldn't buy: love, resilience, and the ability to care for others no matter how little they had. Even in a world that often ignored kids like him, he believed in doing good. He didn't help people for attention, and he certainly didn't expect rewards. Whether it was holding the door open for an elderly neighbor, helping a friend with homework, or simply offering a kind word to someone who needed it, he understood that doing the right thing was not about what you could get in return. But the world had not always been kind to him in return. He had felt the weight of prejudice more times than he could count. The way security guards followed him when he walked into a store. The way some people clutched their purses when he passed them on the sidewalk. The way teachers sometimes assumed he was trouble before he had even opened his mouth. He wasn't angry about it, not in the way people expected him to be. He had simply learned to live with it, to push forward despite the labels the world placed on him. And now, here he was, sitting in the cold snow, holding a billionaire's child in his arms, waiting for a reaction he wasn't sure would come. The man towering above him wasn't just rich, he was powerful. The kind of man who made headlines, whose business empire stretched across industries, who had built his wealth from the ground up, but had long since forgotten what struggle looked like. His wife was just as privileged, though perhaps not as openly cruel. She had grown up in luxury, surrounded by people who looked like her, talked like her, and believed the same things she did. She had never known what it felt like to be dismissed, to be judged unfairly before speaking a word. Together, they lived in a world so far removed from the boy's reality that it might as well have been a different planet. Their wealth had shielded them from struggle, from discomfort, from the need to ever truly see people like him. And they had built their fortune with an arrogance that only power could create. They had spent years believing that people like them were superior, not because they were cruel for the sake of it, but because they had never been forced to question it. They were used to looking down on people, used to assuming that those who had less simply hadn't worked hard enough. And yet, here was this boy, this child they might have dismissed, ignored, or even feared on another day, holding their most precious treasure in his arms. For the first time, the billionaire felt something unfamiliar stir inside him, a question he had never asked himself before. Had he been wrong? The moment the toddler's foot slipped off the curb, time seemed to freeze. The child wobbled, arms flailing, completely unaware of the danger below. A car approached, its tires splashing through the slush, oblivious to the small figure about to stumble into its path. The boy didn't think, he acted. His feet pounded against the icy pavement as he sprinted forward, his breath coming out in sharp bursts. Just as the baby tipped forward, he lunged, wrapping his small arms around the child and yanking them back to safety. The force of the movement sent him stumbling onto the cold ground, but he held the baby tightly, cushioning the fall so the little one wouldn't be hurt. The child let out a startled cry before looking up at him, big eyes wide with confusion, but no longer in danger. The boy sat up slowly, checking the baby's face, hands, and legs. Not a single scratch. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "It's okay," he whispered, gently bouncing the baby in his arms. "You're safe now." The couple, who had just witnessed the terrifying scene unfold, stood frozen in shock. The billionaire's wife gasped, clutching her chest, while her husband's eyes flickered between the boy and the child, now safely cradled in his arms. A tense silence followed. Have you ever witnessed a life-changing moment? A time when you stepped up, not because you had to, but because you knew it was the right thing to do. Where are you watching from, and what time of day is it in your area? Then, the mother rushed forward. "Oh, my God, my baby!" She reached down, her hands shaking as she took the child from the boy's arms. The toddler whimpered but quickly settled in the familiar embrace of his mother. The billionaire exhaled, his sharp features relaxing slightly. "You—" He stopped, running a hand over his face as if struggling to process what had just happened. "You caught her just in time." The boy slowly got to his feet, brushing snow from his sleeves. His heart was still racing, but all he could do was nod. "Thank you," the mother said, her voice trembling. She placed a hand on his shoulder briefly before pulling back. "You saved her." The boy simply shrugged. She needed help. He didn't expect praise. He had done what anyone should do. The billionaire hesitated before clearing his throat. "Yes, well." He nodded stiffly, as though forcing himself to acknowledge the boy's actions. That was quick thinking. Then, just as quickly as the gratitude had appeared, it disappeared behind a thin veil of superiority. He straightened his tie, his usual air of confidence returning. "Still," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for his wife to hear, "what is a kid like this doing around here?" The boy froze. The billionaire's wife looked away, as if pretending she hadn't heard him. It was subtle, barely more than a whisper, but the message was clear. No matter what he had done, no matter how he had just saved their child's life, he would still be seen as someone who didn't belong. Some bystanders, who had stopped to watch the scene unfold, exchanged glances. A few had their phones out, recording the moment, whispering amongst themselves. Some nodded in admiration at the boy's quick action, while others murmured in doubt as if questioning whether he had been truly helpful or just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The boy didn't react. He was used to people making assumptions about him. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. But as he turned to leave, something in the billionaire's expression shifted, just for a second. A flicker of hesitation. A thought he wasn't ready to voice, because deep down he knew. This boy, this kid from a world so different from his own, had just saved the most precious thing in his life. And no amount of money or power could change that. The next morning, the city buzzed with an unexpected headline. A press conference had been called by one of the most powerful business magnates in the country. Cameras were set up. Reporters lined the hall, and speculation ran wild. Some assumed it was a routine business announcement, a new merger or expansion. But the real reason was far from anything the public could have imagined. At the front of the room, standing behind a podium, the billionaire and his wife prepared to speak. The billionaire, a man used to controlling narratives, looked different today, less composed, more introspective. His wife, standing beside him, seemed equally affected by something that had shaken them beyond just their usual polished public image. Then, the screen behind them lit up, showing a picture from the day before, an image of a young black boy, cradling their baby in his arms, his face full of concern, his body tense from the fall he had prevented. "This boy," the billionaire began, his voice steadier than expected, "changed everything for us." The reporters whispered among themselves, some already piecing the story together. The billionaire continued, his grip tightening on the podium. "We live in a world where power, privilege, and success sometimes blind us to what really matters. Yesterday, this young man saved our child's life, not for recognition, not for reward, but because it was simply the right thing to do." The boy, who had been watching from the side, shifted uncomfortably. He had never liked attention. He hadn't expected to see himself on every news channel, hadn't imagined his face being broadcast to millions. But what the billionaire said next stunned him. "We are offering this boy a new future. From this day forward, he will have a home with us. We want to provide him with the education, the resources, and the support he deserves." The crowd gasped. Cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled to ask questions. The boy's heart pounded. Was this real? The billionaire's wife stepped forward, her voice gentler. "This is not charity. This is a chance for us to learn too, to see the world differently. We have spent years living in a bubble, unaware of how much we have taken for granted." The billionaire nodded. "This young man is not just any boy. He is extraordinary." Then came the biggest revelation. A journalist in the front row stood up, flipping through a folder of documents. "Sir, are you aware that this boy has family connections to old wealth?" Silence filled the room. "What do you mean?" the billionaire asked. The reporter adjusted his glasses. "His mother's side of the family, though estranged, has deep ties to a prominent business empire that dates back generations. He is not just some ordinary child from a struggling neighborhood. He is connected to power in ways none of us realized." The billionaire's breath hitched. His wife's hands trembled. Everything they thought they knew about the boy was suddenly shifting. And with that revelation, something deeper changed. This was not a rescue. This was not an act of charity. This was destiny. They had not just taken in a boy. They had given a rightful heir the keys to his future. The billionaire turned back toward the boy, a new look in his eyes. "We are not just offering you a place in our home. We are offering you a place in this empire." The boy's world had just changed forever. The billionaire couple had built an empire on power, influence, and privilege. But for the first time in their lives, they saw the world through a different lens, one shaped not by wealth, but by humanity. Their transformation didn't happen overnight. It was uncomfortable at first, challenging everything they had believed. They had spent years dismissing the struggles of those outside their social circle, assuming that success was simply a matter of effort. But the boy's bravery, his selflessness, had forced them to confront their own biases. They could no longer ignore the truth. Opportunity had never been equally distributed. It wasn't just about hard work. It was about access, about doors that had been closed to so many for so long. So they changed. Instead of hoarding their wealth for the elite, they began investing in the communities they once ignored. They launched initiatives to provide education and mentorship to underprivileged youth, ensuring that more children like the boy had opportunities to rise. They used their influence to push for diversity in leadership, opening spaces for those who had long been excluded. But the most profound transformation happened within their own home. The boy, now a part of their world, had never let go of his roots. Even with access to private schools, luxurious estates, and endless resources, he remained true to who he was. A kid who believed in doing the right thing, no matter the circumstances. He soaked in everything he learned, not just about business, but about leadership, integrity, and responsibility. And as he grew older, he began to shape the very empire that had once seemed untouchable to someone like him. Under his guidance, the company evolved. He focused not just on profit, but on impact. He introduced programs that ensured fair wages, ethical business practices, and corporate investments in underdeveloped communities. He established scholarships, funded small businesses run by marginalized groups, and created leadership opportunities for people who had been overlooked for far too long. People once whispered about how a kid like him didn't belong in a world like this. But now, they looked to him as the future of it. And when the time came for the billionaire to step down, there was no question about who should take his place. The boy, no longer just the kid who had saved a life that fateful day, had grown into a man who would change thousands more. He accepted the position, not for wealth or status, but for the opportunity to ensure that no child would ever be dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated the way he once had been. Because power, when placed in the right hands, wasn't just about control. It was about change. And now, that change was in motion. The empire had once been built on exclusivity and power, a monument to privilege where wealth stayed in the hands of a select few. But under the boy's leadership it had become something different, something greater. No longer was it just a business empire driven by profit. Now it was a force for change, an example of what happened when power was used for something beyond self-interest. With every decision he made, the boy, now a young man, ensured that the company wasn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. He introduced programs that lifted people out of poverty, provided opportunities to those who had been ignored, and built a system where success wasn't just for the privileged few, but for anyone willing to work for it. It wasn't about giving handouts. It was about opening doors, doors that had been shut for far too long. The billionaire, once blinded by his own status, had come to admire the young leader he had underestimated. He watched as the boy, the same child he had dismissed as not belonging, turned his empire into a legacy of inclusivity and justice. He saw his company grow in ways he had never imagined, not just financially, but in reputation, in impact, in meaning. The young CEO wasn't just running a business. He was changing the way the world worked. He partnered with activists and leaders who had long fought for equality, using his platform to amplify voices that had been ignored. He didn't just donate money. He created systems that ensured lasting change, scholarships that paved the way for future leaders, mentorship programs that guided those who had never been given a fair chance. His influence stretched beyond boardrooms. Governments took notice. Other businesses followed his example. And soon, the movement he had started reached beyond just one empire. But through it all, he never forgot where he came from. He still visited the community center where he had spent so many afternoons as a child. He still walked through the neighborhoods that had shaped him, speaking to kids who reminded him of the boy he once was. And he made sure they knew the truth. Where you start does not define where you will end up. In the final scene, he stood in a grand boardroom, surrounded by a diverse team of executives, men and women of all backgrounds, people who had once been overlooked, now sitting at the table where decisions were made. He gazed out at the city skyline, the very same one that had once seemed untouchable to him. But now it belonged to him. Not just as a CEO, not just as a businessman, but as a leader who had changed the course of an empire. The world had dismissed him once, but he had chosen to rise. He turned back to his team, his voice steady, his presence undeniable. What the world might dismiss, I choose to embrace. Every person deserves a chance to rise, no matter where they start. And with that, the future had never looked brighter.